Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's meeting of the Audit and Scrutiny Committee. Before we begin, I'd like to start with the usual items of protocol around online meeting, as today is a hybrid meeting. So please remember that a recording will be made available on the Council's YouTube channel following the meeting, and to ensure that your contributions are picked up in the recording, please use your microphone when speaking and switch it off again when you're finished speaking. If you'd like to raise a question online, please use the raise your hand feature on Microsoft Teams, and myself and the officers attending will ensure all requests to speak are seen. And of course, avoid using the chat function for debate amongst one another online. The officers attending the meeting this afternoon are Stephen Quinn, the Chief Executive of the Council, Margaret McCrossan, Head of Accountancy, Michelle Blair, Chief Auditor, Linda Hutchison, Senior Democratic Services Officer, Victoria Hartness, Committee Services Officer, Leslie Ann Burns, Assistant Committee Services Officer, and Grace Scanlon from Ernst & Young External Auditors. In terms of apologies for absence, Clerk, do we have any noted? Okay, that's great, thank you. Item 2, declarations of interest. The Council's Code of Conduct requires elected members to declare any financial or non-financial interests on items in today's agenda. Are there any declarations to be made? No declarations. Okay, item 3 is my Chair's report. So, just to update the committee, as was the case last year, I've received a mailing from Ernst & Young as external auditors, asking me in my capacity as chair of the committee to make what's called a letter of representation. So it's asking for the committee's assurance in various different regards, such as our awareness of any instances of fraud, any breaches of internal control, our knowledge of related parties, and any actual or potential litigation or claims that would affect the Council's accounts. So I'm in the process of preparing a formal written response to go back to Ernst & Young. So it's just to note that point. Are you happy to accept the report? Okay, accepted, thanks. Item 4 is an item of clarification on the maintenance, primarily grass cutting, of private land, which the committee raised before, and I'll bring in Linda at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this report simply summarises the clarification that was requested by the committee and circulated on the maintenance of private land, and it's recommended that the committee note the position.
Okay, that's great, thank you. I'm certainly quite pleased to see that the level we're talking about here is only the marginal fuel costs, £500, which I consider to be immaterial. Are there any comments or contributions, Councillor Box?
With these pieces of land that we have, I recall about 6 months ago, on behalf of a resident, a local businessman who was looking to a particular piece of land in my ward, Ward 3, and was trying to get some response from the council about ownership, etc., and what was coming back to him, and confirmed with me, with the officer at the time, which was that the council did not own the land. So I actually responded to the officer and said, well, why are we maintaining it? Why are we cutting the grass? Why have we got East Renfrewshire personnel cutting the grass? And then it came back a few days later, said, oh yes, it looks like we do own that piece of land. So quite significantly that, that this is overdue, I would suggest. Interested to know when it says work is underway with legal services to support a future CMT report. Can I ask what the nature of that report is going to be, and what the sort of broad remit of that report is? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Wallace. Is there anyone on hand who could answer that at the moment?
All I know at the moment is that I think work is being done to check the seasons register, and I can only assume that the report that's going to be done will be based on the outcome of that exercise. So I think they're trying to check who the legal owner of these pieces of land are. That's the only information I can tell you at the moment.
Okay. Councillor Ireland.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. It's following up on Councillor Wallace's question. Again, I noted the report is to come back, and it just says it's to go back to the CMT in 2024. Is there any indication when that report will go to the CMT? And following from that, when will that then be passed to the Audit and Scrutiny Committee? I note that the actual savings, it's saying the actual savings of stopping the work has been calculated as £500 in fuel costs. But I wondered if there was an indication of how much the work is currently costing in manpower, how much that's costing to the council right now, and will we get sight of that once that further work has been done?
Okay, Stephen Quinn.
Thank you, Councillor, for your question. I don't have all the details. You'll probably imagine it sits with the Director of Environment, who is not here today. However, what I can say, first of all, carrying on from Linda's response, there are a number of these pieces of land which are historical, that date back to being maintained pre-East Renfrewshire Council, and therefore they were taken on, and then they were done by a commercial organisation. That was then brought over onto council. So there's a whole different array of ways that we came upon historically dealing with the pieces of land, and then thereafter, some very small, others a little bit bigger. When they talk about the actual cost, the only other way you really save money here is by having one less operative. You know, so that person does not do just that. That person, or these people, would be out doing numerous pieces of grass cutting, and as part of that would pick up all of these pieces of land. If you don't have that person, then they wouldn't be able to do the council pieces of land. So they pick that up as an additional on the road, if you like, or on the route, by and large. So we would either be saving a full-time person, which means we couldn't then do the council parts of land, or we're not saving any. So essentially what you're really saving is the cost of fuel, cost of machinery in terms of upkeep and so on, which incidentally you need to upkeep anyway, because we still need to do all the other pieces of land. The piece of work to council, back to corporate management team, sorry, is, as Linda alluded to seek to try and find out exactly who owns all of these pieces of land. That I don't have a timescale for, because that is dependent on our legal department and them able to access the required records, and where those records don't exist, having to then find and do the investigative work to go and find out who owns it. It's not always just straightforward. In other words, some will be straightforward, some will probably be quite difficult. So I don't have a timescale for that. And finally, I think your other part was, there was certainly within the report, there wasn't an intention to bring anything back to audit and scrutiny, because at that point I think this was to clarify the amount of work that takes place. Whatever the report that comes back, that work would still be taking place, because we don't see it as, at the moment, a reasonable step to do to stop all of the grass cutting, given the complications that might bring, given probably some of the backlash it might bring, because these things have been done for 30, 40, 50 years, and given the cost, is it worth that? So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that gives some context, Stephen. I mean, when this point was first noted, it was when the council was going into setting its budget for the 24-25 year, and as part of that there were a range of different savings options which were being considered, and the debate started. We shouldn't be potentially removing grass cutting services where the council does have an obligation, whilst providing it to areas where there isn't an obligation. So I think that now we have the context that the marginal cost, so what's the actual extra cost of providing this, is the fuel costs of around £500. I think there's a case to be made that if certain pieces of ground were allowed to deteriorate, it could attract fly tipping, for example, which would actually attract a larger cost than what's currently being outlaid. So I think that's good context. Okay, based on that, I don't see any further hands raised. Gordon, yeah?
Just briefly, yes, there's the maintenance side of it, but that example I gave earlier on, more concerned about the asset register. I mean, that's a plot of land that belongs to us, presumably was not on the asset register before, and it was quite a valuable piece of land. Thanks.
Okay, so I think the wider point there is around ownership and not necessarily maintenance. Councillor Buchanan.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think from recollection, it was back a good few years now, and I think Councillor Wallace may remember it, a lot of the issues that we've had in some sites like this, in terms of ownership, has been that over the years, particularly in the Mearns side of the authority, there was a company that was called the Green Belt Company, and they had been given, whether it be ownership or the responsibility for maintenance of many of the shared sites that are in many of the housing developments, and that had been done, by recollection, by the developers of those sites at the time, and they had handed over numerous kind of patches of land and ground to the Green Belt Company, who were then responsible for maintenance, and they were also then involved in factoring and some of the aspects there. So I suspect it probably is quite an exercise to try and find out the genuine ownership, because I think there's parts, some of it may belong to residents in the area. Some might well belong still to the Green Belt Company, which my understanding is no longer exists. And it's whether or not any of those areas then transferred or would be transferred, whether it be to council, to residents, a whole number of areas. Yeah. But I know that it probably is quite a complex issue to try and find out the ownership of many of these patches of ground now. And equally, I know that the council has the issue, as has been touched on, about the maintenance of it, because otherwise you potentially get into other situations, whether it be fly tipping, etc. And I know that some work was done originally, and a number of discussions working back to when Greenbelt still existed. And I think there was one or two other companies that had similar scopes in terms of the factoring issue and what was happening. But yeah, it is a complex area, unfortunately.
Thank you. Councillor Wallace, I also note, Councillor Redland, that there was an issue around West Acres, which you had been considering, so I don't know, perhaps you want to address that issue after Councillor Wallace has spoken.
No, just to say, I feel we're just kind of skirting around the issues here, which is that we've had constant, I don't know how many years that our budget's been cut in real terms, and here we are down the line, and we don't know what our assets are. I mean, that particular piece of land I'm talking about is probably worth, I don't know, it could be upwards of £1 million. So, and that's not there. So I feel that, as I say, this report that's coming before CMT is not before time. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. Councillor Edlin, you wish to speak?
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the West Acres parcel that I had discussed with the Chief Legal Officer and with the Leader of the Council at a meeting about 2 weeks ago, Mr Mahan had identified several parcels of land in West Acres, some of which belong to the council, some of which belong to private landowners. And there was not really an issue of actually maintenance. It was really one of the community council who just wanted to know in general terms what was being done. And that was clarified we were told that basically the council titled properties that the council obviously owns will be maintained by the council, and the non-council areas which are privately owned will not be maintained by the council, which seems perfectly reasonable. But we now have heard today about parcels of land which are, for historical or other reasons, are being maintained by the council that really, in my reckoning, should not be. And perhaps it might be sensible for us to go to the Chief Legal Officer and ask his department or somebody in planning to identify all these parcels of land which don't belong to the council, because the papers are very clear, and the Chief Legal Officer certainly was able to identify it very clearly, although it's something a layman probably couldn't do. But it would be possible to identify all these parcels of land and get back to the owner and stop this process to save the council some money. So that is my thought on it at the moment.
Okay, and note your comments, thank you. I don't know if there's anything particular you want to come back on that, or I don't think there's any further comments. No? So on that basis, we obviously will find out a bit more about what's brought to the corporate management team, and in the meantime, we're happy to accept this item. Yeah, okay. So item 5 is the review of a national external audit report, which is local government and finance in Scotland. And I'd like to invite Margaret to introduce this item. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. This is an annual report that's brought by the Accounts Commission, and it comments on the annual accounts figures that are published for all Scottish councils. Due to the time that's required to pull together these reports and publish them, this only came out January this year. So with all the budget work that was going on there, this is the first chance we've had to bring it to the Audit and Scrutiny Committee. Generally, the report makes high-level comments about the finances right across Scotland, and what we've tried to do in our response today is to comment on where East Renfrewshire is in line with the general trends and where we are maybe slightly different from the experience elsewhere in Scotland. So it covers mainly the 22-23 position, but it also looks at how things have been developing in 23-4 and looks ahead a little bit to 24-5. So I have commented at various points on all 3 years, but just to put this in context, there will also be another external audit report coming up in the next month or two, or published in the next month or two, which we'll respond to in due course for audit and scrutiny, and it will comment more specifically on how councils have been setting their budgets for 24-5. So that's just the background, and I'd be happy to try and answer any comments or queries if you've got them on any of the 3 years that are covered in this report.
I suppose my kind of opening remark, Margaret, would be paragraph 7. Between the year 2013-14 and to the decade ahead, 22-23, the local government share of the Scottish budget had fallen from 30% to 23%, whilst the Scottish national budget increased in real terms by 37%. And I think that probably accounts for why we just spent the last 15 minutes talking about grass cutting, because that's the scale of the financial pressure which the local authority is under. Things which have happened for decades without thought are now being given consideration to both by officers and elected members, as we try to strain out every sinew to balance the budget in the light of this dearth of central funding. I'd like to open up to questions. Councillor Wallace.
Yeah, just with the kind of forecast here, and I appreciate, yes, it's 3 years, and appreciate also that the Chief Financial Officer does not have a crystal ball. However, I'm conscious that very soon we're going to be engaging in building a leisure centre just behind us here, about £60-odd million. And when we're hearing of other authorities at the moment actually closing leisure centres and facilities such as that, libraries, etc., just how confident we are that we will be able to, yes, it's one thing using capital in order to, and I appreciate it's a slightly different formula that we're using, however, we will have to maintain it, we'll have to pay the loan costs, etc., over various years through the revenue account. So just curious as to how the Chief Officer feels about, Financial Officer feels about that. Thanks.
Thanks. I think you pick up a point that's relevant to councils all across Scotland, that the capital pressures impact on our revenue pressures through not just the running costs, but particularly at the moment on the loan charges. And that's why when we're setting the budgets, we always have more than just the budget report or the capital plan. We preface them by a longer term financial plan report on the revenue side and the capital investment strategy on the capital side, as well as the the Treasury Management Report, which has our prudential indicators in it, which comes to Audit and Scrutiny for scrutiny before it even gets to Council. And that's because we have to prove that it's affordable and sustainable, whether it's a revenue plan or particularly if it's a major capital plan. And the report that's in front of us today does pick up on that, because one of the recommendations that they make is that the Council should make a bit more use of financial resilience measures, and that picks up on some of the things that we cover in the Treasury Management and Prudential Indicators report that comes to Audit and Scrutiny in Council. So the ones I'm particularly referring to here are the percentages of your revenue stream that you should not exceed, or it's not a hard and fast requirement, but it's guidance. We have quoted on many occasions, I know you'll remember, that when we're looking at housing investment, it's generally well known that you try to keep the revenue impact of the loan repayments under 40%. For the general fund, this broader council services, it's not one that's been used very much or discussed very much, because until recent years it hasn't become much of a pressure. But all across Scotland it is now a pressure, and generally it's said that you shouldn't really exceed 10% or at worst 12%. Now, we've done a bit of forward forecasting, and with the existing capital plans we've got, the 10-year capital plan that was approved just at the end of February there, in about the next 5 years or so, we will be up to about 9.1% of our revenue stream being committed to loan charges, and that's still within the tolerances. But you're right, it's getting closer, and it's something that we're going to have to keep ever more careful oversight of.
Councillor Wallace, wish to come back in? Are you quite happy with that? Anyone else with any points of contributions? I have Councillor Ireland.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, it was that paragraph 23 that caught my eye as well, and Margaret has just commented on that the loan charges are forecast to rise from around 9 million to some almost 20 million by 29-30. I suppose my question is, what is that the bigger works that are driving that? And yes, I'm glad to hear that we are keeping a close eye on that, because it is getting quite close to that, the limit of 10%. But it's just to ask again, what really is driving that large increase?
And obviously large projects do contribute towards the increase in the percentage, but increasingly we're finding that the general capital grant is not enough for our normal annual capital requirements. So the fact that you're having to constantly invest in IT or in long-term maintenance and upgrades, roof replacements or boiler upgrades, and particularly for zero carbon stuff, if we get around about £5 million a year in capital grant, that's not going to be enough for just a normal year's demands. So increasingly we have to either borrow or generate capital receipts or developer contributions. And so I couldn't say it's only the major projects. There is an underlying general capital pressure that is pushing this up as well.
Thank you.
Okay, staying with that issue, Margaret, the forecast of loan charges, it's more than doubling. Presumably you've used some sort of modelling for what you think will happen to interest rates in that case, because obviously the increase in the cost of capital over the last year or so will have had an impact on that too. Not just the fact that you're borrowing more, but the fact that what we already are borrowing will potentially cost more. Is that the case? And what kind of predictions have you made?
That's a really relevant question. At the moment, the budget that we've set for 24/5 and for the 10-year capital plan beyond that does take account of our current assumptions, that broadly we're going to be looking around 4% or so for our borrowing rates. However, we do get quarterly updates from our Treasury advisors, and even just checking this morning, the latest assumptions are that interest rates are unlikely to start falling until the summer, perhaps June. So even then, they'll fall pretty slowly. On the one hand, it's good, we'll continue to get better returns on our investments, but it also means that we will continue to try to put off borrowing as long as we can until we see the rates beginning to come down. And it might be that we, instead of waiting for the long-term rates to come down to where we want, we might have to borrow short-term for a little while if we have to take on borrowing. But then when we have to replace that, we should be doing it at lower rates. So that will factor in. The figures that we've got just now and that I mentioned in paragraph 23, that was on the basis of our budget planning at the turn of the year. We will be reviewing as we start already looking at our 25/6 budget plans. We'll be looking again at what our capital is going to be, because we now know how much money was spent at the 31st of March and how much capital will be brought forward, unfinished projects that have to be taken forward and finished in 24/5. So we'll look again at what the capital expenditure profile is and the updated interest rates. And I should also say that because the guidance figure is a percentage, we will also look at what we're forecasting future years' revenue budget figures to be. So it might be that our budget's going to rise in future years as we have to factor in inflation and pay awards and so forth. So that will actually help bring the percentage down a little bit if we're factoring in future years' increases in the budget. So we've got both sides still to build into our modelling as we approach 25/6.
Very much trying to hit a moving target by the sounds of it then. Councillor Gordon-Wallace again.
Chair, do we have, is that lady from External Audit, is that with us? Grace, I beg your pardon, Grace. I do beg. I'm just curious, what's the feeling with External Audit just now with that figure of 10%? Do you think that is sustainable? I know that there's been mention in the conversation earlier about the potential for increase in budget, etc. But I think history has told us, and we're still paying for huge debts through COVID and what have you, that the likelihood of these increased budgets are scant, if you like. I think it's highly unlikely we're going to be seeing real-term increases. Therefore, is that 10% sustainable? Do we see that is a realistic figure to be? I mean, at the moment, we're looking at what, 2029, 30, that we're going to be at 9.1%. So just curious as to what External Audit feel about this. Thanks.
So I guess that we look at it on an annual basis as part of our work on the Council's financial sustainability, and so that's what we report on within our annual audit report. So we do consider that kind of longer term view. I guess that in particular this year then we're very aware of the kind of changing financial position and the changing funding around that, and particularly the outcome of any of the discussions with Scottish Government for councils, with COSLA in particular. So I guess we'll kind of take it into account as we do our work. But you will be aware that last year, certainly within our risk-based assessment, then we did classify financial sustainability as a red risk, and we hope that those kind of findings will find their way into the next report that Margaret referred to, coming from Audit Scotland, which might help bring on the sector a little bit more.
Okay. Any further comments or? Okay. On that basis, we're happy to accept the report. Okay. Agreed. Thanks, and thanks for all your contributions on that, Margaret. That's quite detailed. Okay, the last item on today's agenda is a review of the internal audit plan for 23-24 and an update on some recent audit reports, and I'll come over to Michelle for that.
Thank you, Chair. As stated in the report, 7 audits relating to Plan 23-24 audit work have been issued in the quarter. I can actually update you, it's actually 8 because we issued one after the papers were issued. I've got 6 still to be issued relating to 23-24 and they should be done over the next few weeks. Audits where responses have been received since the last progress report are listed in Appendix 3. 3 of these reports have been circulated in full to Audit Committee members, including the departmental responses. That's school clusters, one of the follow-up audits and payroll. Regarding the payroll audit, I had a couple of questions from Councillor Wallace on Tuesday, which I responded directly to him. The queries were relating to when the errors that had occurred due to the system being set up incorrectly would be quantified. And you'll see in the paper circulated, that point wasn't accepted by management, but having spoken to the HR manager yesterday, I can now confirm that 2 of the recommendations that weren't accepted previously have now been accepted, and she's given me an updated response to that, which is good. She's also given me a date of the 30th of June for that to be implemented. There was also a comment in the report about when the system would be updated to negate the need for manual adjustments, and Kath, the HR manager, again confirmed that that is now in place. I think it was put in place middle of April this year. As noted in the covering report, there's no new requests for assistance using contingency time at this point in time. And subject to any questions, I would ask you to note the progress report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before I open it out to general questions, you probably guess I'm going to home in on this payroll item on page 19. I mean, the iTrent system is used by many local authorities, and I believe the nature of the weakness here is systemic. It originates with the system. There's a potentially a financial loss to the council. I appreciate it's not quantified as of yet, of people being overpaid and that being irrecoverable. I'm not sure if anyone's looked at the contract for the external organisation who implemented that software and configured it and set it up, but is there any initial thinking in terms of liability and who is liable for this? Is it the software provider? Is it the people who implemented the software for us, or is it internal?
I think that would really be a question for maybe legal and procurement, if they would know the terms of the contract.
I appreciate that that's somewhat kind of with the remit of the actual work to establish that there is a problem, but I think that's something that would be really good to get feedback on. Stephen, you indicate you wish to speak.
Thanks, Councillor. The point you make there is Michelle's right. It's obviously Michelle wouldn't be able to answer that, but what I'll do is we'll take that away today and we'll ask that question of legal to see if there is any area for recourse or not. I don't know if there is, but we can certainly go away and ask that question.
Okay, that's great, thank you. I'd like to open up to any general questions. I know Councillor Wallace, obviously you submitted an email, but is there anything further today?
No, I'm just curious as to what the change of heart was with the payroll people in terms of actually coming to a final, deciding to actually quantify it in value terms of how much we've either overpaid or underpaid. Thanks.
I can't obviously speak on behalf of the HR manager, but my understanding from the conversation I had with her is when they initially responded to the report, she was thinking at it from a systems point of view that she would have to get the system to calculate all the unders and overs. When I spoke to her yesterday, she said they were going to manually calculate it, so that it basically only affects the people that are on multiple week patterns. It only affects mainly starters, leavers and people that have been off sick. So she can pull out that detail and narrow it down to a smaller number of staff, and then they'll manually go through. That is the way she explained it to me.
Okay. Councillor Ireland has a hand raised, and I've sent other questions online if you'd like to use the raise your hand feature.
Thank you, Chair. Michelle, I was actually really pleased to hear what you said, that they had came back and agreed to 2 of those recommendations that they had previously said no to. So am I right in saying that we will now get a report that will come back to yourself on the monetary value of the errors that have been made? And did I hear you say that that would be done by June? Because personally, I was quite shocked at the scale of this and how many were wrong in the sample that was done. I think there was a sample of 14 and 11 were wrong. So my second question was, is there a possibility that there are employees right now that have been underpaid that do not know it yet that this might bring up? Is that the case, or have those errors been caught and that raised with the employees? So it was. Thank you.
Okay, Michelle.
Okay, so there's a number of issues. The sample we picked, we specifically directed it towards multiple week patterns. We didn't really sample many people on normal patterns, if you know what I mean, because we knew the problem was multiple weeks. So that's why it's quite a high percentage. Yes, there will be people who have been under or overpaid and they don't know it, but that's what this exercise should flush out. I don't know.
And is it right? Is the report coming back to you in June? Will you get that bigger piece of work?
I won't necessarily get it in June, but we would certainly get it at some point because it would be part of our follow-up of this audit.
Thank you.
Councillor, just to add, I've actually spoken to payroll myself before coming to audit and scrutiny today, and if it gives members any confidence, the amounts we are talking about range between 25 and £40 before any deductions in salary. So yes, there will be across a group of people who Michelle has outlined, there are the potential for under and overpayments to have happened, but that amount will sit between the region of around 25 to £40 before any deductions are taken from people's salaries, such as tax and pension contributions and national insurance and so forth. Thank you.
I mean, that is somewhat kind of more reassuring, but in terms of the detailed audit work, there's some fairly substantial overpayments which have been made, and it feels kind of like a double-edged sword, because people have been overpaid. There may be question marks around the extent of recovery of those funds, but also for employees who have been underpaid, are we potentially looking at a breach of employment law and associated costs which could come with that as well? You know, I appreciate external audit is listening to this, and they'll be kind of forming their own view of risk on what they test. But I don't know, Grace, if you'd have anything to kind of input at this stage before we move on to taking questions.
I think that we knew that there were issues being raised by Michelle last year, and so certainly we extended the testing on payroll, but we weren't finding some of the errors. So in our usual sample testing, then we weren't replicating errors, and it might just be that they're at too low a level for us to pick it up, especially when we're doing it across a large population. So at this stage, we don't think that there'll be additional work for us to do beyond what Michelle's doing, but we'll certainly look at that as we go through.
Okay, that's good to know, thank you. So the sequence I have is Councillor Edlin, then MacDonald, and then Ireland.
Sorry to sound a bit obtuse here, but just listening to the conversation and having read the report, I'm not quite... How many cases are involved? If it's 25 to 40 pounds per case and it's £55,000 in total, am I right in saying that, or could I be wrong? I'm trying to just get my head round the whole dimension of this, which is a bit confusing for me. Maybe I'm just being obtuse in this, but if you could help me with this, I would like to have a bit more clarity in this. And how long has it been going on for? How many runs were there on the system? I presume the payments are done monthly. So how many runs did this happen and over what period?
It's basically been happening since the implementation of iTrent, which was, I don't know what year it was, maybe 2021 or thereabouts. But it is a small group of staff. It's not all staff. It's only the ones that are on these multiple week patterns, you know, that they maybe work 130 hours one month, 140 the other, but it averages at 150, 140, yeah, and averages 135 or whatever. Somebody like myself who's on a standard pattern, it wouldn't affect me. We don't actually know the numbers, but HR manager would probably be able to provide the numbers.
I think if I could just continue, sure. I think this committee would want to know how the numbers in detail, because this has been going on for 3 years, all for very long, small sums obviously, because it's 55,000 over 3 financial years. In terms of the payroll, it's not a lot, but I think we should have it quantified exactly to us.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. If I can throw another limb into the arm's length of this.
Just to respond to Councillor Edlin.
Yeah, I'll come in.
I will get the figures and they will be available from HR. I would just reiterate that my gut feeling, and I'm confident in it, that it's not material to the council, but there's a lot of smaller amounts. The other thing to consider is because it affects leavers and starters, you could potentially have somebody who's started and left in the same period, so they might potentially have an under and an overpayment that balances out, potentially. We just don't know, but we will get the figures.
The point I was going to make to supplement what Councillor Edlin had said there, I wasn't a councillor at the time of the job retention scheme during coronavirus, but if the council did use that and did put people on furlough, is there any impact potentially of people on those variable work patterns, potentially in terms of what was claimed?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't know if anybody else can answer.
If I can come in on that one, the council itself didn't put anyone on furlough,
right.
Although I think the trust did. So the only risk of that would be if there was a subset of people in that kind of category who worked for the trust at that time.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Going back with the sequence, so I have Councillor MacDonald, Ireland, and then Wallace to add to the list. Councillor MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to say that I find it quite concerning, actually, the fact that these anomalies exist within the system. Certainly, underpayments are easier to rectify than overpayments, in the sense that, you know, once they're identified, the council can make amends to have that underpayment rectified. But I guess the question I have is that going forward, any overpayments that have been made, particularly overpayments, I should say, for former employees of the council, I want to know exactly what mechanism is in place in order for us to recoup these monies, because as I understand it, while the majority of these overpayments might be small, there are significant overpayments, and I understand that there is one particular case for an individual who's been overpaid, I think it's either £13,000 or £16,000. That's a considerable amount of money. The mistakes exist, and large amounts of money can be mistakenly underpaid or overpaid. So going forward, I really would like answers as to how we plan to recoup money, particularly from those people that are now former employees. I would imagine the process of doing that is quite a lengthy one, and perhaps even a costly one to the council, at which point, maybe some point in the future, the council might turn and make a decision and think to themselves, well, this isn't financially viable for us to chase this anymore, similar to non-payment of council tax. So while I recognise that the majority of the payments are significantly a lot lower than this, I do think it would be prudent going forward for senior officers from payroll to appear before the committee to answer questions, because I think, you know, it's all well and good that we have people in this room today, but can't give specific answers to the questions that we really need to focus on, and that is how the problems started in the first place, give us a better understanding of the software system as it is, and identify the problems as they happened. I think we would be much more. It would be a much more valuable exercise overall for members of this committee to hear from people firsthand that are responsible for payroll. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That I think it would be good to hear from the officer responsible for that. Obviously, they're not here. We can't just go and drag them down. I think we should ask for a paper to come back to the committee But I think Michelle has something to add just now.
I really just wanted to clarify, there's two sets of overpayments. Earlier on in the payroll report, the overpayments and underpayments we're talking about are system related. The system was set up wrongly and they are all generally smaller amounts. The overpayments that are nearer the end of the report, these are not system related. These are due to late submission of details. And yes, that has to be addressed because we're not good at recovering it. So it's just to clarify that there's two separate sets of under and overpayments.
That's great, thank you. Margaret, you want to add?
Yeah, if I can maybe come in on a couple of these points. As Michelle said, we think there may be two main reasons. Some of the smaller amounts, it's the way the system's been set up. Some of the larger amounts are more likely to be because managers have not advised payroll in time of someone who's leaving. So I'm not really sure if one of the payroll team would be able to add too much to that, given it's really, we've got to get the managers to get the information in time. Payroll are really at the end of the chain in that one. But I think the main thing I wanted to pick up here was the original question was, how do we go about recovering any of these larger overpayments if someone has already left the council and we can't directly attach from their regular pay? In that case, we would be handing the information over to the council's debtors team, and we would be issuing a debtors account and following the council's debt recovery policy. I can't remember, I think it came up, it was last refreshed maybe sometime last year to Cabinet or Council, and that would set out the various steps and processes of sending out a debtors account and the follow-up and when it would be passed over to perhaps a third party, a sheriff officer or whatever, and what the circumstances would be for us to take the decision that it was to be not pursued any further. And there are about half a dozen different reasons why you would eventually come to that point. So we would just be following the existing council policies on that one, and it's not something that is easily written off, and that would have to be brought back to council as part of the annual write-off reports as well.
Okay, that's good to know. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. Just to get some clarity from yourself, Chair, around payroll. So you're asking that payroll would come back and give an explanation. And I just need to be clear, just to pick up on Michelle and Margaret's points. In reference to the payroll system, that is the report that you have today in front of you. That's where payroll have a responsibility, and that report is here with you today. In terms of formal process of recovering debt, Margaret has gone through that, and payroll have got no influence or no jurisdiction in dealing with that, and therefore would add no value by coming here. In respect of the larger payments, which generally come from human error in different ways, or systems not being followed or not being completed in time or whatever, again, payroll could add no value by coming here and speaking to that. It is not their part of the error. In respect of how many people this affects and the costs, whether that's under and overpayments, most certainly payroll will get that information, and it can be brought back to allow the committee to get that full information. But that's the only bit that payroll could offer an explanation on, and I don't see that it would be of any service to the committee for payroll to come and answer the other parts where they have got no jurisdiction. And in my capacity, I'm suggesting that they even add value to the committee on those areas.
Then I understand what you're saying in terms of payroll process, what they're told to process, essentially. In that basis then, is there another department or officer who would be more appropriate to report back, perhaps debtors, perhaps legal, or otherwise?
So Margaret has given an explanation of how we go through the debtors process. If committee are looking for a further report on what we do, we can furnish you with that. But it's a straightforward process, and again, any officer can come and tell you, but they're going to tell you the exact same thing. It's a process that we go through, that all councils in Scotland will go through, and bringing somebody to committee is not going to give you any further or less information.
Put a link into the debtors policy, the latest debtors policy, and circulate that.
I think probably what would be of even more value is perhaps hearing an update in due course, which we would anyway from Michelle, in terms of how the audit recommendations have been implemented, so that we know this doesn't happen again in the future. Now there's a couple of requests to speak. Councillor Ireland's been waiting some time, then I'll take Councillor Wallace.
Thank you, Chair. It is the larger payments that I wanted to ask a question about. I've quickly added up what we have in front of us in the larger report, and it's far in excess of £50,000. So I wanted to know, is this the sum total of all those larger overpayments that we have in front of us? Is that figure likely to be much higher? But also I noted that there is a draft policy on the treatment of over and under payments that was circulated in March 2023, but this hasn't been formally issued as a council policy. Is that likely to come forward and be taken on board as a council policy? Because I've noticed that the treatment and some of these overpayments can differ from overpayment to overpayment. So if I could have an answer on those two questions, please.
Yeah, I see that myself in paragraph 4.6 of the full report.
Yes.
In terms of the figures we're talking about, in the actual payroll report that I circulated, obviously the table is just our sample. It's not the full list of overpayments. I tried to summarise on page 8 of the original report of what the kind of figures are that we're having as overpayments per year, and it's roughly about 180,000. In terms of the policy, that would really have to be put to the HR manager in terms of when it might even be out now. It just wasn't at the time of the audit. I haven't really followed up on that because at the time of the audit it wasn't in place.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, that's great. I'm being told that that information will be made available. So. Councillor Gordon-Wallace.
Yeah, I can imagine trying to claim that money back or trying to bring it back into what's been owed would be a bit of a minefield, not just for us getting that money back, but also for the individual that owes that money. I don't mean in terms of the ability to do so, but I mean, they presumably paid tax on that at some point. So do they get money from the HMRC to that they see what I'm getting at? Okay. Anyway, that's for somebody else to sort out. But a lot of this, from what I can understand, is coming back to the failure of managers throughout the organisation to inform payroll that somebody's coming to the end of their contract or leaving or whatever. And I seem to recall from previous reports that we've had that the manner in which we actually deal with employees who are leaving is not great in terms of things like passwords to computer systems, etc. And it's maybe a whole area that we maybe need to just tighten up on or revisit or see exactly what our processes are, and that's probably more to do not so much with payroll but more to do with the systems that managers are supposed to carry out. Thanks.
Yeah, that's well noted. Thank you, Councillor Wallace. And you want to come in on that? Yeah.
Just when you mentioned the leavers process, I'm sure Michelle could probably quote it to you. It's a recurring theme in Michelle's payroll and HR audits, and certainly as a staff manager, I know that it was the subject of one of the follow-up audits very recently. I just put in a response in the last few weeks where Michelle was following up and asking all managers across the council to provide evidence that they had reminded all of their team leaders of the need to completely follow the leavers checklist and not just notify HR that someone's leaving, but also IT, and take back all their kit and disable all their passwords, and go through the whole checklist that you have to adhere to whenever one of your staff leaves. And I had to provide evidence that I had passed that information, that instruction on to all of my team leaders. And I imagine every other manager in the council's had to do the same thing, but it's actively being reinforced virtually every time Michelle does a follow-up HR and payroll audit. I can vouch for that as an auditee.
Yeah. It's not actually just the HR and payroll audits, it's just about every audit we do. If we're looking at system access, we're not good at taking levers off systems. It's a recurring theme, and it'll probably feature in the annual report.
I distinctly remember that being discussed when we were discussing resilience in IT systems. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Wallace, it's your point there around overpayments and people, whether they're still in the organisation or have indeed have left the organisation. It's something I'm glad you bring it up with, several thousand plus employees. Unfortunately and invariably, mistakes get made. But what you need to do is learn from those and minimise them. And if it gives you any confidence, what I've asked for now as part of the corporate management team going forward, that reports will come to corporate management team on an ongoing basis from each of the departments on overpayments. But the overpayment's one part, or the underpayment, but I'm more concerned about why. What broke down in the process that allowed that to happen? And therefore, does that allow us, where necessary, to change processes? Or does it allow us to tighten up in who is completing paperwork and when they're completing it and when it is getting to payroll? Are the timescales in payroll adequate to allow that to be processed in time for payment, debacks to pay into someone's bank account? So, as I say, to give you some confidence, I've now asked for that report to come on a regular basis to the corporate management team so that we can look at not necessarily just the overpayments, but the reasons for them, to try and minimise them. With the best will in the world, some will always happen when you've got thousands of employees in an organisation, but it is prudent to do everything you can to minimise those, because even where you get repayment, for some people perhaps they haven't recognised it's an overpayment if it's fairly smaller amounts, but nevertheless it can be quite a hardship to have to pay it back. So it's actually incumbent on us to do our best to ensure that the mistake doesn't happen in the first place. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you. There's all sorts of considerations there beyond just the financial, as you alluded to, Stephen, around reputation as an employer, etc. We want to attract the best folk, so I recognise that. We've had a good going through this particular issue. There's obviously action points which will be taken away, and we will get an update in terms of the implementation of the recommendations. And I can see that there's specific recommendations in there around the treatment of leavers, for example. Are there any other audits?
Yeah, just to give context, I mean, I appreciate we've got 4,000 employees and about 185,000 payments that we're making over the year, and when you actually drive this down into the context of this, it appears minimal, but it does have impact, and I appreciate what you're saying. So we're not here to try and find fault, but only that any fault that is there that we can do something about. Thanks.
So can I just be clear then? So we're noting that there'll be feedback on follow-up work done by internal audit. There'll be feedback from payroll on the issues that they can address, but which is limited to the first point that the Chief Executive raised. I'll circulate the debt recovery policy, whatever it's called, and we'll seek clarification on the policy referred to for 2023 to see whether or not it's been implemented or not. Yeah.
That sounds pretty comprehensive. Councillor Edlin there?
Actually, I found the Chief Executive and Ms Blair's comments quite comforting, but are the debt recovery processes the same for all processes of the council, or is it different for council tax debt than it is for overpayment of staff? Because I would have thought that it would be one is there are different types of things, and there's less human considerations, different types of considerations. So, I mean, I just wonder, is there one policy for everything, or is there various policies?
I think we'll have to differentiate, Councillor Edlin, around current employees and former employees. So where someone's a current employee, obviously we would work with that individual to understand, what can they pay back, how are they going to do that, over what period of time. That's a much more personal touch because they work with us, and you would work with that person on that basis. Someone who's left the organisation, obviously that relationship we don't have with them, and therefore the manner in doing that would be different in that you can't have those ongoing conversations because they don't pay a salary. We don't pay them a salary every month. So it would be very different from a current employee to those that have left the organisation. In respect of those that have left, I'll let Margaret answer that because I don't know whether, I'm assuming we would do the same process, but I'll let Margaret answer that.
In most cases, if it's someone that's external to the organisation, it'll be the general debt recovery policy. But I think maybe you were picking up on the point that there is an exception to that, and that would be in benefits overpayments, and there are slightly different arrangements that might be brought to bear for benefits overpayments, which are slightly different.
It's like,
you have a supplementary, Councillor Ridley? You have a supplementary you want to...
And I just a comment, really, it seems to be an absolute nightmare situation to sort it all out, because you've got all the benefit situations, you've got everything else going back, you've got the differentiation of the classes of employment, etc. So, I mean, and then you've got to consider the human aspects of it. I mean, somebody who doesn't pay their council tax is different from somebody who is being overpaid. Okay, anyway, that's just a comment. I don't think it calls for further.
Yeah, no worries at all. I have Councillor Dave McDonald with a raised hand.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of points. One was, many times people leave organisations like councils and move on to other councils. So my question is, if somebody was, for example, say, owing East Renfrewshire Council a large amount of money and moved on to another council organisation, is there any kind of framework involved that we can communicate with the new organisation that person works with to recoup funds that way through the wage system of their new employer? Because presumably, if somebody works for a council and then moves on to another council, it seems almost a logical process whereby there would be some sort of formal arrangement between the former employer and the new employer to recoup the funds that have been overpaid. So that's one question. The other thing, and I'll just make this final point, I think it's worth making, though, albeit quite uncomfortable to mention, and it was to do with something that Councillor Wallace had mentioned about the fact that these problems, many of the problems exist because of human error, and human error particularly of line managers that have failed to notify payroll in time of a change of circumstances. So I guess the question is, when that human error takes place, is there some sort of record that goes against that particular employee's record that they have made that error, so to be able to track any multiple errors over a period of time? So a habitual offender, if you will, in terms of making the mistake on a repetitive basis, there comes a point where I think probably the council would be fairly reasonable for the council to assess that individual's employment status going forward. So I just wanted to know if there's any kind of traceable way to keep a record of these mistakes being made. Thanks.
Okay. Think of who's best placed to pick up some of the points you've made there, Councillor MacDonald. Stephen, yeah?
Thank you, Councillor, for your questions. And on the first basis, whilst I can't say for absolutely sure, it is my best understanding that we have no mechanism through legal or other processes to go to another council. There are GDPR issues and other issues, I'm guessing, that would stop us from being able to do that and dealing with confidentiality of the employee in the first case. In respect of your second question, really I think what you're alluding to is competency of an individual employee, and within competency there are policies in the council that would be followed. However, let me say, in the first instance, if we are really serious about being a council of choice and a council who looks after their employees, then in the first instance it would be incumbent upon us to work with their employees, to support them and to help them carry out their jobs in the best way they can. I will always work in the basis that the vast majority of people come to work with the aim of doing the very best job they can, and it is our job as a council to support them to do so. However, of course, in the nature of their jobs and the nature of their roles, if they continually are unable to do something, then we would go through the appropriate council policy and the appropriate council processes. And in the first instance, that would ensure that we give them the necessary training, the necessary support to help them do their job, and thereafter move into the other more formal processes as per council policy. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, Margaret, yeah.
As the Chief Exec said, we wouldn't normally go directly to another employer, particularly if it's another council. However, as part of the debt recovery policy, as we go further into it, if we're not getting any response from normal follow-up measures, particularly when we go to external agencies, then if they know where that person works, they may be able to put in place attachments to earnings. That's one of the possible steps that they may have at a later stage.
Okay, that's very helpful, thank you. Councillor MacDonald, your hand is still raised.
Yeah, just wanted to briefly mention there that there are processes in place whereby if somebody, for instance, were to default on their council tax payments and build up a substantial amount of debt, and then they move on to another council area, councils talk to each other. Financial departments of councils talk to each other, particularly for council tax debt. That's one of the reasons why a council asks you where you're moving on to when you leave your property, because they ultimately share that information with one another and they can chase debt through that way. So I'm somewhat confused as to how that is allowed to play out in terms of chasing council tax debt between one council and another. But if it comes down to a substantial overpayment, the GDPR suddenly kicks in.
I think the payment of a tax is different to someone who has received a sum of money through no fault. There's been an error which has been no fault of their own, which I'm sure you would agree is a different situation from somebody willfully not paying their taxes. I don't think there's any other point to add to that. Are there any final comments or questions to contribute at this stage? Now, I appreciate we've gone through quite a lengthy discussion on the payroll side of things, which I was expecting, and I very much appreciate input from Michelle and Margaret and Stephen and others on this. Are there any other points on the other audits within this report which people would like to discuss or raise at all, or otherwise quite happy with what Michelle has stated there? Okay, I'm not seeing any request to speak. So on that basis, I'd be happy to accept the report and the follow-up points which Linda outlined some time ago. Yes. Okay, with that brings us to the end of today's agenda. So thank you very much for your attendance and input.